And Top Story is always brought to you by Vodafone. Now, there is cautious optimism tonight among investors holding treasury bills and other government instruments following President Akufo-Addo's assurance last night that your investment will not be touched as part of desperate efforts to restructure Ghana's debt for an IMF bailout. There are also questions about Ghana's ability to secure an IMF executive board deal without first restructuring her debt, which the World Bank recently projected at 104.6% GDP by end of the year. The news of an impending debt restructuring sent the markets into panic, forcing many to dump their bonds and terminate their investments with banks. The president yesterday blamed it on speculators.
Recent turbulence on the financial markets was caused by low inflows of foreign exchange and was made worse in the last 2 to 3 weeks, in particular, by the activities of speculators and the black market. An anonymous 2-minute audio message on a WhatsApp platform predicting a so-called haircut on government bonds sent all of us into banks and forex bureaus to dump our CDs, and before we knew it, the CD had depreciated even further. I also want to assure all Ghanaians that no individual or institutional investor, including pension funds, in government treasury bills or instruments, will lose their money as a result of our ongoing IMF negotiations. There will be no haircuts. So I urge all of you to ignore the false rumors. Just as in the banking sector cleanup, government ensured that the 4.6 million depositors affected by the exercise did not lose their deposits.
So that is the president there. Today, Information Minister Kojo Nkrumah went further, clarifying the government's resolve not to implement a haircut covers your principle.
So earlier, there was no turbulence on the market until somebody threw out there that there was going to be debt restructuring. And so people started panicking, withdrawing their CDs and buying dollars. Then it went further with speculation that there was going to be haircut. And that also now added to some more anxiety on the market. A few days ago, you would recall that at some of the public events, you had people openly saying that principals were going to suffer haircuts. I think the president responded clearly yesterday by saying, and if I may read you his words in his address, he says that there will be no haircut.
So that's the information minister there speaking today on the midday news on Joy 99.7 FM. But keeping them honest, did government miss an opportunity to mitigate the economic crisis by waiting this long to deal decisively with news about an impending debt restructuring? Well, my colleague Kofi-Addo, data analyst with our research desk, joins us now with details of what we're learning about how this news of a restructuring first came to be. Kofi, so we had the president blame this on a 2-minute audio that was circulated on WhatsApp.
Exactly.
But if you track back, we've gone way back to 20th of September.
Absolutely.
First time, a very credible global business news outlet published details of what they then said was going to be an impending restructuring with talks already underway.
Well, Evans, Bloomberg on 20th September, just like you mentioned, published an article with a headline, Ghana set to start debt restructuring talks for local bonds. And portions of the article read, it says, Ghana is poised to start talks with domestic, bondholders on a restructuring of its local currency debt as part of, the West African nation's plan to secure a $3 billion IMF loan from the international fund market. And another critical point raised was that Ghana's largest debt investors, including local, banks and then pension funds, are preparing to engage in discussions on debt, a reorganization that could entail extension of maturities and haircuts on principals and interest payments, according to people familiar with the matter.
Okay,
so that was Bloomberg on September 20th.
That's Bloomberg, and Bloomberg is a very credible, international business news outlet. Now, most importantly, 3 days after the Bloomberg story emerged, Fitch stepped in to downgrade our creditworthiness even further into junk status. But interesting is the primary reason they did that.
So they actually gave more than 5 key drivers of their double C downgrade. And, increased probability of debt restructuring was number one raised by, Fitch.
And they were clear to point.
Very clear.
To the press reports. What did they say about that?
It says that the downgrade reflects the increased likelihood that Ghana would pursue a debt restructuring given mounting, financing stress with surging interest costs on domestic debt and a prolonged lack of access to the Eurobond market. That was the reason that they gave. And it says that there is a high likelihood that the IMF support program currently being negotiated will require some form of debt treatment due to the climbing interest cost and restructuring of revenue as a percentage of GDP. That was Fitch.
But he also specifically mentioned in the second paragraph the item of the press reports, where they had said that government had failed to respond to.
Absolutely. So it says that, if you look at government's latest response, that was about 37 days, which is 5 weeks, 2 days that government actually failed to, come to respond to this, article that Bloomberg is put out.
Now, so that is a very important point to observe, that even with the downgrade that we saw from Fitch, they are clear in giving us the reasons for that further downgrade. And they say that, quote, the government has not confirmed or denied press reports that Ghana is preparing to negotiate restructuring. That is after they had laid out their own expectation that there's going to be restructuring. That almost suggests that if we didn't, and this is the 3 days after the Bloomberg report, it almost suggests that if government had responded in the emphatic manner the president did last night, to dealing and dismissing that initial report as it emerged, we may possibly...
A lot of things would have been corrected.
Yes, and we may possibly have not had that additional junk status downgrade.
And the speculation that we
Fitch
saw.
was very clear. So it's a possibility was there that, if the president knew this, and this happened first reported by Bloomberg on the 20th of September, if the government knew they were not going to do a haircut, if they had been categorical, then possibly Fitch would not have, because they mentioned that directly, that the press reports was feeding into the additional downgrade there. But also, there may have been WhatsApp messages, but for those who are acting, when Bloomberg reports this, it sort of then leads to a direct
In fact, to the extent that they raise more than 5 key drivers, and that, increased probability of high debt restructure was number one.
On that. And
government should have really taken.
And it's not a coincidence that this downgrade came 3 days after the Bloomberg report that there was certainly going to be a downgrade. Let's get into this a bit more because of how sensitive this matter is. And I want to bring in Professor of Finance and Economist, Professor Godfrey Bokwing, who joins us on the telephone line right now. Prof, thanks for your time here on Top Story.
Yes, good evening, Evans, and good evening to your cherished listeners.
I mean, let's start by doing some basic education. Is there a difference between a haircut and debt restructuring?
Well, debt restructuring can take baseline 1 or 2 strategies. One of them may entail a haircut. Another may also take debt rescheduling. But if you look at the effect, the treatment effect of the two, they are almost the same.
So when we heard the president yesterday categorically saying there will not be a haircut, remember that he's saying this more than a month after Bloomberg first published that article that there was going to be a haircut. Was it shooting ourselves in the foot by waiting this long? Because you remember, as we just indicated, 3 days after that Bloomberg, Fitch downgrades that and they referenced Bloomberg.
Well, I think that it's been a difficulty on the part of government. I'm guessing. I'm just making an an intellectual guess, let me put it that way, it's been a bit difficult on the part of government to go that path of debt restructuring that would entail a haircut. I foresee the difficulty that the government has, and probably the reason negotiation with the fund is dragging in terms of also completing the debt sustainability analysis. The reason is that it's common knowledge that the financial system is the ultimate residual risk claimant of public debt overhang. In other words, if the state fails to manage its public debt efficiently, that would influence the soundness and solvency of the overall public sector balance sheet, and consequently, the financial sector stability. So even if the government, as they have done, didn't tell us officially that there will be debt restructuring, the data points to that. Hello, Evans?
Yes.
The data lends to that. The current challenges lends to that. I heard that you were referencing Bloomberg in September.
Yes.
Observers within this country, very knowledgeable people within this country, had held this view long before Bloomberg came out. Okay? We had done work with funding from ASEP. We did a public forum in August and concluded that our debt is unsustainable, debt restructuring is unavoidable, that may entail a haircut. That's clear. Now, you see why, on one breath, the president said that there will be no haircuts. Okay? On another breath, he says that we are looking at achieving debt sustainability in the next 6 years to about 55%, external debt servicing obligation to about 18%. Okay, that's where the president gave himself up. And I'll tell you why. If you look at the data and you put in the modeling with the cutoff year at 6 years from now, and you want to crawl back to a sustainable debt level, you could not achieve that solely by embarking on fiscal adjustment, which may entail a combination of expenditure cuts and then revenue enhancement. That will not be sufficient. Then you have to go to debt treatment. So if the framework that the president is working with is for us to achieve debt sustainability by 2028 to about 55%, and in terms of the external debt component to about 18%, that is below the policy dependency threshold, then the president should just admit that that could not be done without debt restructuring, which may entail a haircut, right?
Do I hear you saying categorically, Prof, that when the president says categorically last night that there shall be no haircut, it is just impossible?
You know, ordinarily, I would have taken that statement as the gospel truth. Ordinary. Look, I should have no basis to doubt my president. Look, because the president has access to data that I don't have. The president would have been briefed by his negotiation team after the engagement with the IMF in Washington. So the president is a more powerful, blessed with data and resources. So when the president says that there will be no haircut, I should not take that with a pinch of salt, let alone a bag of salt. Okay? But I'm looking at the reality, and I'm looking at where we find ourselves right now. And when you look at the modeling, you immediately come to the conclusion that couldn't reflect, that will not reflect the reality, right? And probably the reason maybe the Minister of Information, right?
Yes.
Came out to say that when the president said this, he meant this. That was, he said, his understanding. But the question I asked myself was, I'm not sure the president wrote the speech himself. I want to believe that this was pre-recorded.
Yes.
They would have seen it. So, and they would have asked themselves, how would the public interpret it? If that was the information minister's understanding, how would we have understood it also? So, because at the end of the day, you want to communicate hope, but that has to reflect reality. But baseline, it was a good thing that the president came out to address us. But I want to believe that there wasn't enough information and assurance in the speech.
I mean, and very directly, within the context of an IMF program, can we get a deal at the executive board level if we do not restructure?
Well, it's very simple. The debt sustainability analysis would have pointed to a certain outcome. And the outcome will be that you need to restructure your debt. First, you have to do some fiscal adjustment. That's what we've been talking about, some painful fiscal adjustment. Then you will realize that, Evans, that will not be enough. Okay? Then, on the basis of that, you then go to your creditors and say that this is where my debt sustainability analysis is arriving at. This is where we are. These are the steps that we are taking in terms of expenditure cuts, revenue enhancement, but we still have a gap that we have to close. Can you meet us halfway? That's very important.
Yeah, but the president has taken that off the table now.
Well, we see you want a program from the fund. If the president was going to lend himself money, we will take what he has said as that's it, and we'll go and sleep. But the point is that you want a program from the IMF, and that is why both parties converge at this level that staff level agreement is most likely by the end of this year, and that is different from a program. Are we together?
We are
Reaching
together.
A staff level agreement doesn't mean money will flow from the IMF immediately. Reaching a staff level agreement will mean that we have agreed on broad-based fiscal framework that will help us to achieve debt sustainability by this date and that date with certain structural reforms, indicative targets, quarter by quarter, and all of that. And then on the basis of that, you can then engage creditors. Okay? So you engage creditors with that framework. Then you reach some level of agreement with creditors. Sometimes it doesn't have to be a formal agreement signed. Once that broad-based understanding is reached with investors, you can then present that together with the staff level agreement to the IMF Executive Board. It is only when the IMF Executive Board approves your program, then will you say that you have a program. I'll give you an example. Hello?
Yes.
In the case of Zambia, they reached a staff level agreement. That wasn't a program. Nothing came from the fund by way of inflows. On the basis of that staff level agreement, Zambia now reach out to their creditors. And that negotiation, Evans.
Yes.
The case of Zambia, I think it took about 6 months or 8 months before they reached some level of agreement with creditors. And then the staff level agreement then moved from that level to the IMF Executive Board. So, and that is why in our case, what gives us confidence that debt restructuring seems unavoidable is that they are all talking about staff level agreement by the end of this year. This wasn't the case when we were negotiating the 16th IMF program, the call for the 16th IMF program was made on August 6, 2014. The program kicked in April 3, 2015. Right? In this case, we are talking about staff level agreement. When you reach that level of agreement, you can then engage with creditors and have some broad understanding, which will then give assurance to the IMF executive board that your debt will now be sustainable within the period that has been discussed. That is when the board will approve the program.
In simple terms, like the Zambia example, we can reach a staff-level agreement by end of year. Fact. However, until we restructure and produce a credible plan to the executive board that our debt is sustainable, like Zambia did, they had to restructure and reach an agreement with their creditors and investors. We can't expect to get a deal.
That has to be done unless government put alternative on the table of how you can claw back to a debt sustainable level without the path that the DSA is pointing to.
Okay. Prof, I'm grateful for that clarity on this subject with the President's declaration that there will be no haircut. Thank you very much for your thoughts on this. I want to bring in a man who was a Deputy Finance Minister at the last time we engaged the IMF on the same subject, Kaysel Atufo-Sing. Dr. Kaysel Atufo-Sing is the ranking on the Finance Committee in Parliament. Dr. Forsing, you were on record first who had predicted at the first, in July, when we first announced that we're going to go to the IMF, that it will include debt restructuring. But the President was clear last night that a haircut is off the table. As we know, haircut and restructuring could be different, although a haircut can be one element in general restructuring. So tell me, you heard the President yesterday. Your thoughts on this particular aspect of no haircut?
Evans, first, I don't know the basis the President made that statement. But if you run the math, it doesn't add up. And I'll be surprised that Ghana will get an IMF program without a haircut. And I can also say on authority that there will be some form of haircut. Clearly, someone is not briefing the President properly, or probably the writing did not come out well. In quote, the President goofed. He shouldn't have said it in a categorical manner, because what it has done is that it has sent additional uncertainties to the market, clearly indicating that someone is not on top of his job. I do not know how our debt will be sustainable by the year 2028, bringing it to over 100% to 55%, clearly indicating that you have to shave off 50% of your debt without a debt restructuring. It's impossible. Some form of debt restructuring is certainly possible.
You could do a host of things. You could reduce expenditure, raise more revenue, and renegotiate, say, with the bilateral donors, etc. I mean, there's a whole lot without doing anything.
Evans, I've run the numbers since the President made an announcement. You know, today, our external debt service is 35% to total revenue. He's saying he's going to reduce it by 2028 to 16%, half what he has announced. That does not come easy. You will need a combination of principal haircut on the external, a combination of interest haircut on the external, maturity extension to say 15, 20 years on the external, and then the fact that 2023 you may not be paying interest until you achieve that by 2028. This is easy to do. It is arithmetic. There's a methodology. You put it in and it gives you the answer. Same as the domestic. There will be some form of debt restructuring. There will be some form of debt operation. In fact, it will mean that you will have to cut some interest that we are paying. Look at our debt stock today. Look at interest that we pay today. Ghana is paying so much in interest, domestic interest. The math will not work if you do not give domestic interest haircut. So that's why I'm saying that the President goofed.
Yeah,
Probably he did not get this right.
But dog, you can have debt restructuring without a haircut. That's possible.
How?
I mean, so one of the ways you can refinance the debt, that's one. Secondly, you can extend maturities. I mean, that could be restructured without necessarily asking us to take a cut on our principal and our interest.
But Evans, first of all, you should recognize where we are as a country. Our debt by the end of this year will be 104% of GDP. You need to bring it down to 55% of GDP. Simple put, you will need a debt relief worth 50% of your GDP. In fact, you have to halve your current debt stock by the end of 2028. So you will need to look at a number of things you have to do. And you can run simulations probably look at scenarios, and the scenarios does not add up if you do not add haircut. So he can make a categorical statement, just like they made categorical statement on the IMF program that they will not go for an IMF program. In the end, they went for an IMF program. I can also say, in the same vein, he has made a categorical statement that there will be no haircut. We are watching. In the end, there was going to be another backtrack. They will make a U-turn in a bad way. These things hurt the president's credibility. His handlers must guide him properly, because clearly there will be some form of haircut. Yeah. He shouldn't have made comment on this haircut matter. He should have allowed it to lie low and probably find a better way to deal with the speculation. But his statement on the debt restructuring alone has caused different form of speculation in the bond market. Today, we've seen some bonds rallying, obviously in the sense that they think there's not going to be domestic bond, some form of haircut either side. But that will mean that anytime there's another announcement that there's going to be a debt restructuring, the situation will get very worse. So please, when a president is making certain categorical statements, you have to first run the maths. Don't let the president make statements when you have not run the maths, because what he said, simply put, means that the IMF program is not going to come on. That is my view. And that is very dangerous. The president shouldn't have made that kind of statement.
Dr. Akufo-Addo, you're joining me for dinner tonight on PM Express as we get into this a bit more.
Thank you.
You want to join us then? Thank you, Dr. Akufo-Addo. He's my guest on PM Express tonight. We have a two-part show for you on PM Express tonight, because we want to break this all down. Bright Simmons will join us. Bright Simmons is the Vice President of Imani Africa. Will join us with a breakdown and his own analysis of what the President had said last night. We'll also have, as I said, Dr. Akufo-Addo join us, and Dr. Kojo Asante. He is a leading voice in the coalition of the Citizen Coalition. Of course, he is specifically with CDD, but they last week also laid out a series of demands for the president, where the expectations met. He will join us for the first part. And then the second part, we'll have a one-on-one with the information minister. On the back of everything else, the analysis that we'll hear in the first part, we'll put all those issues that will come up in the first part to him. Kojo Ponkroma will be my guest in the second part of PM Express. We want to do this holistically and comprehensively. You want to join us from 9 all the way to 11 p.m. tonight on PM Express. Join us then. Newsnight in a minute.